We back. Look, don't blame me. Blame the folks that scheduled me to work tomorrow morning, and I still got to get the content out to you on my schedule. What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at NerdTees. It is just after, I think, 10 p.m. Tuesday evening, and this is our option, and we are going to exercise it. Welcome to week 18 of my weekly CFL football pick show for the 2019 CFL regular season and postseason. And after our heads being a little underwater a couple weeks ago, now our heads are a little above water after last week. 7-5 across all of the picks in week 17 action. 2-2 straight up, 2-2 against the spread, and actually got 3 of the 4 totals picked correctly, which is a nice sign that maybe the totals might be starting to turn around after a 1-3 week the week before. 45-20 straight up. I've now dipped just a little bit below 70%. I'm at 69%. Nice on the season. 40-24-1 against the spread means I'm 62% against the spread on the season, and still underwater on the totals, 31-34, but instead of being 46%, which I was, I'm now up to 48%, so we're starting that climb. Standings unchanged in the East Division with the exception of the Montreal Alouettes, who have now guaranteed their spot, booked their ticket, not only to the CFL playoffs, but to a home playoff game. And if you would have said that to the Owls at the beginning of the season, I think they would have had to have pinched themselves. Saskatchewan, by virtue of their win last week, jumps up at 10-4 into the lead in the West Division, followed closely by Calgary, 9-5, losing that crucial game last week. You also have Winnipeg, who's booked their ticket. They're at 9-6, and they're kind of skidding here a little bit. And then you've still got Saskatchewan and BC in behind them, and either one of those teams could still potentially make a run at that crossover spot. In the official CFL Fantasy Football League last week, I've moved up a little bit. I think I'm now in 27th place out of the 75 people in that pool. Brought in 86.8 points in week 17. Has me at 1,401.4 points on the season. So again, we're kind of climbing up a little bit. If I could finish the season inside the top 20, I'd be pretty okay with that. My Week 17 MVP, definitely Mike Riley. He had himself a huge week last week. 276 pass yards, 5 touchdowns, no picks, added 10 yards on 2 carries, no rushing touchdowns, which might be a bit of an anomaly for Mike Riley. 32 fantasy points for Mike Riley last week. He led the way for my squad. My Week 18 fantasy lineup, and oh boy, it is a mishmash all across the board, is now right in front of your eyes, and you're going to see right away at the quarterback position. Mccloud, Bethel, Thompson, who came into the game for the Argos last week. We've got to assume he's getting the start this week against probably the worst defense in the league. So we're going to run with him. He was a low-cost option, which allows me to kind of spend up at a couple of other positions. And I tried to basically grab like one player from each game at the very least. Now, you see, I did stack Mccloud, Bethel, Thompson with one of his receivers, and again, I just kind of went all over the board for my fantasy lineup here. It's basically a make or break kind of week for me. It's really, it's boom or bust. That's exactly where we're going with fantasy this week. So kind of grabbed a little bit all across the board. That's my fantasy lineup in week 18. Love it or hate it. The Week 18 slate of games in the CFL looks like this. You've got Ottawa in Toronto taking on the Argonauts in what could be considered the Washington Redskins and Miami Dolphins of the CFL. You've got Saskatchewan in Calgary, probably the marquee matchup of the week, Riders taking on the Stamps. Montreal is in Winnipeg to take on the Blue Bombers, and the BC Lions are in Edmonton to take on the suddenly skidding Eskimos. Kind of like last time when I was down here, I'm kind of hoping this shuts off any time now, hopefully when I'm in the middle of a very important sentence so that the sound just becomes a little more clear for us here. We're going to start in Toronto with this game that I think only hardcore fans of these two specific teams are looking forward to. The Ottawa REDBLACKS in Toronto to take on the Argos. REDBLACKS losers of 7 consecutive games, and in the last 4 are being outscored 3 times over. They're scoring 11 points a game. They're giving up 34. They're coming off of a 5-point loss at home against the Edmonton Eskimos back in week 16, and the offense was once again absolutely useless up until a 13-point fourth quarter in what could be considered garbage time. They kind of backdoor themselves into a cover against the spread. The self-proclaimed 1-2 punch at quarterback, resulting in just 273 pass yards and 1 rushing touchdown for the Ottawa REDBLACKS against a defense that in the previous 7 games had given up at least 25 points a game in the Edmonton Eskimos. That defense has not played well lately, and that quarterback tandem still couldn't get it done. For the second week in a row, R.J. Harris decided he wanted to show up. 6 catches for 71 yards, so good on R.J. Harris. And luckily this time around, Dominique Rhymes decided that he wanted to follow suit. 5 catches for 104 yards for Dominique Rhymes. What did I say? I hoped it would shut off, and it shut off. And to think for Ottawa just a little bit more. If only there was another quarterback. And we'll get to that. The Toronto Argos at 2-12 on the season, losers of 3 straight games, being outscored on average 34-22 over their last 4, coming off of a 55-8 disgusting drubbing at the hands of the BC Lions that was in BC. And how much do you really want to hear about a game that was over in under 10 minutes? Here's the bright spot for the Argos. Mccloud, Bethel, Thompson comes back into this game to take over for James Franklin, who was completely ineffective yet again. Again, a quarterback change that never should have been made. So MBT comes back into the game, and all he does is throws for 94 yards and a touchdown. It's almost as if he wasn't the problem. The Toronto Argos also making moves off the field. General manager Jim Popp has been relieved of his duties and was actually replaced by an interesting secondary candidate, Mike Pinball Clemens, an absolute legend in the CFL, but not exactly what I would call a new voice. Because, he's been involved with the team basically since he retired. I think he coached them for a little bit a few years back. So, it's not exactly a fresh voice for the Argos. Time will tell whether that choice is actually a good one. It was a good choice to get rid of Jim Popp because I just don't think he really had a handle on what he was trying to do with that team. So like I said with the REDBLACKS, if only there was another quarterback in the room, well, there is. That quarterback's name is Will Arndt, and Will Arndt has been named the starter for this football game. I've been calling for it for weeks. Hallelujah. Thank you, whatever member of the REDBLACKS front office actually watches this show and decided to take my advice. So, Will Arndt starting for Ottawa. You got to assume Mccloud, Bethel, Thompson starting for Toronto. So, the quarterback position's kind of taken care of, for lack of a better term, for both of these teams. Now the question is, somebody's got to win, so who's it going to be? I think if I'm going to err on the side of the better quarterback. And between the two of them, it's Mccloud, Bethel, Thompson. He is the better quarterback. Had Toronto kept James Franklin, and we're going to be committed to staying with James Franklin for the rest of the season, I probably would have grabbed Ottawa in the upset here because I don't think the difference between these two teams is all that much. But with Mccloud, Bethel, Thompson in there, I think there is a big difference, and that is at the quarterback position. He's the best quarterback on the field in that game. We're going to go with the Toronto Argos. So let's take Toronto at home to pick up a victory against Ottawa. On the line, the Argos are a single-point favorite at home, which means Vegas has no idea what's going on with this football game. I think the line opened at Toronto, I think was -2.5 or something like that. I get it because there's so much quarterback turmoil here that who in the world knows what's going on. But I like Toronto to win. It's the smallest of margins that I have to pay, the smallest of prices. So let's lay that single point and take Toronto -1. Total in the game set at 48 points. I personally have this capped around a low 50, but I do think the game gets to 50. Ergo, I'm actually going to take the over, which is going against what most people are taking in this game. I don't think it flies over, but I think it will get there probably in garbage time, which is rather symbolic of this football game. So we're going to go over 48 points in Toronto, Ottawa. Let's go to Calgary now. Roughriders and Stampeders. Again, like I said, probably the marquee matchup of this week. Both of these teams coming into this game Winners of 3 of their last 4 games. Saski has won 3 straight, whereas Calgary dropped that game last week in Montreal. The second kind of fluky, quote-unquote, loss to the Alouettes this season. Riders coming in off a 21-6 victory against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers last week. That game was in Saskatchewan. And look, this was the blueprint. Cody Fajardo drove the offense. The defense did their job. And in the process, the Riders grabbed first overall in the West Division, something that not a lot of people, I think, were calling when this team started 1-3. And if you don't believe me that I was calling it, go check my Twitter and my CFL futures bets. Anyway, 347 total yards of offense for Cody Fajardo between his pass yards and his rush yards. He did throw for a passing touchdown, and a monster night for Shaq Evans at the wide receiver position for Saski. 7 catches for $193 and that receiving touchdown from the hand of Fajardo. The Riders' defense generating 4 total turnovers in that football game, including 2 interceptions off of Chris Streveler, and we'll talk about the Chris Streveler of it all when we talk about the Winnipeg game. A good pass rush, which is no surprise with Saskatchewan. Very active secondary. They got to clean up the penalties, and I've said this multiple times about Saskatchewan this season, and they're just not getting it through their brains. They took another 9 penalties for 88 yards. They got to clean that up, and if they cleaned that up in this game last week, that's basically a perfect game for the Riders. Calgary dropping that aforementioned 4-point game in Montreal, a game that, of course, allowed the Alouettes to clinch a playoff spot and a home playoff game for the first time in years. Stamps played a good football game. I'm not going to sit here and say that just because they lost, they played a bad game, but they dropped a game that they badly needed to win, and that's because of the context of the playoff race in the West Division. This loss drops them out of that. It drops them immediately anyway out of that race for first place in the West Division. That bye week means the world to the Calgary Stampeders, and they've used it to their advantage in the past. They want that bye week, and that loss is a game I don't think they should lose if they want that bye week. 464 yards passing for Levi Mitchell, so he definitely aired the football out in the same week where he basically talked about some of the inner workings of the Minnesota Vikings and Kirk Cousins quarterback relationship, basically saying that the Vikings didn't like the fact that Mitchell walked in and said, "I want to take Kirk Cousins' job." But despite the fact that he threw for 464, he still only threw 1 touchdown and still threw a pick. So since he came back from injury, 6 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. I talked about it last week. It's still a problem. Of note for the Stampeders, breakout game for rookie wide receiver Josh Huff. 9 catches for 149 yards and a touchdown. And that stat line basically doubles his receiving yardage on the season. And it was his first CFL touchdown coming off the hand of a surefire Hall of Famer in Levi Mitchell. Huge game for Josh Huff. Congratulations to him on his first CFL tutty. As I said, this is a marquee matchup. As far as I'm concerned, it comes down to a game of inches. And if this is going to be the inch that decides it, I wouldn't be shocked. No West team has beaten Calgary in Calgary yet this season. Both of Calgary's home losses have come against teams in the East Division. There was that game against Ottawa all the way back in week 1, and then the first loss to Montreal, that overtime 40-34 game. Those are the only 2 losses Calgary has at home this season, both against teams that are not in the same division as them. And that's the way I'm going to lean in this game. I'm going to lean on the Calgary Stampeders to pick up a big win, put themselves right back in the race, right back in position to compete for that bye. And this is another game that they absolutely, desperately need to win. And they're a good enough team that they're going to realize that, and I think they're going to play up to that level. So let's take the Stamps at home to beat Saski. On the line, Calgary, a 3-point favorite at home. I think I'm going to lay those 3 points. It's a relatively small price to pay. It's just a field goal. So let's take Calgary minus the 3 points at home. Total in the game set at 47.5 points, and this is a perfect total. Couple different ways I capped this. I landed basically exactly at 47 points. So it's really, really a perfect total. Really a coin flip here. but I think I'm going to skew under on it simply because that's the type of game that Calgary's playing right now. Low scoring, leaning on the defense, and if they follow that blueprint to try to win this game, I just think it stays under the number, even though it's going to be a sweat, I think, one way or the other. So let's skew under on this one, go under 47.5 points in Calgary, Saskatchewan. And before we move on, I'm going to take the opportunity, as I always do, to pump the tires of my wonderful friends and sponsors for the second time today at NerdTees. NerdTees.ca. Use that promo code BWFinest, and that is going to save you 15% at checkout. You're going to get free shipping in Canada on any order over $75. Or if you're one of my CFL fans and viewers in the United States, 2 clicks of a button and everything is in US dollars for you. Today's blend is lemon ginger, and the reason I'm having the lemon ginger right now, which I usually reserve for when I'm feeling sick, is because this is my second recording session today, and I felt the need to soothe the throat a little bit. Nerdtees.ca, hit that promo code BWFinest, save your 15%, get your free shipping, find yourself something to love, or find someone you love something to love just in time for Christmas. And you can do it at nerdtees.ca. Let's go to Winnipeg now, where the Blue Bombers are going to welcome the Montreal Alouettes into town. Alouettes 8-6 now on the season, coming off of that victory 21-17, which we talked about, a home victory against the Calgary Stampeders. And what a statement signature win for this Alouettes team, especially on the defense. That was an absolute gem of a second half defensively for the Montreal Alouettes. The Owls defense generating 3 turnovers and 5 punts off of Levi Mitchell and the Calgary Stampeders just in the second half of that football game, despite allowing 17 first half points and 560 total yards of offense throughout the entire game. The Alouettes clinched their first home playoff game since all the way back in 2014, and it seems likely that they're going to play either Edmonton or the BC Lions as the crossover team. Yes, BC is in fact still alive in this playoff race, which makes the next game we're going to talk about all the more interesting. But those two teams are combined 5-11 away from their home building to this point in the season. Can you imagine we could be talking in just a few short weeks about the Montreal Alouettes being in the East Final? That's crazy. Meanwhile, the Blue Bombers enter this game losers of 3 straight, and when they looked kind of like a layup to win the West Division, it is certainly far from that at this point after the last few games they've had. They're coming off of a 21-6 loss in Saskatchewan against the Riders last week, and it was the wrong time for the offense to go ice cold, because this loss drops them into what I call a road playoff spot. So they're locked in, they're making the playoffs one way or the other. But now with the standings, Winnipeg would have to hit the road and go to Calgary. If the regular season ended right now, that would be their first round playoff matchup, is playing in Calgary against the Stamps. No bueno if you're Winnipeg. Chris Streveler has proved in his opportunity this season exactly why he is a backup rushing quarterback. And I think there's no player in the CFL that I've soured on more, especially over the last few weeks, than Chris Streveler. Look, he's got 12 rushing touchdowns. He's a phenomenal rusher, and when they put him in situations to accentuate his positives, he can really be a difference maker. But throwing the football, he's thrown 6 touchdowns in 11 games to go along with 10 interceptions. His passing game is not good enough for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to be competitive with the top teams in this league. And in that game against Saskatchewan last week, the defense made plays. They had 4 sacks on Cody Fajardo. They had 3 pass knockdowns. The defense was making plays, trying to keep Winnipeg in that game. And they played disciplined. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers are the least penalized team in the CFL in terms of total penalties and in terms of penalty yardage. So this is the most disciplined team in football, but it's a quarterback-driven league. And the quarterback play of Chris Streveler is not going to be good enough. And I just said it. The proof is in the pudding right there in exactly what I just said. It's a quarterback-driven league. And if I believe in it, which I do, I'm going to put my faith in it. Which means I'm going to put my faith in this matchup in the best quarterback. And the best quarterback in this matchup is not playing for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. It's Vernon Adams playing with the Montreal Alouettes. I'm going to take the Alouettes on the road in Winnipeg to pick up a big victory, even though they're already locked into the playoffs. Doesn't matter. No adrenaline dump here as far as I'm concerned. Montreal keeps rolling. Alouettes upset the Blue Bombers. On the line, the Bombers are understandably 4-point favorites at home, but I like Montreal to win. I think this would be a fairly decent hedge one way or the other, because Winnipeg's certainly not lighting the league on fire lately. So I think this would be a decent hedge, but even if you're not hedging, like, look, Montreal +4. That's the way I'm going. I like them to win. So we're going to take those points. Go Montreal +4. Total in the game set at 47 points. I think this game hits 50, so I feel fairly good about telling you to take the over here. We're going to go over 47 points in Montreal-Winnipeg, and the last game we're going to look at is the BC Lions traveling to Edmonton to take on the Eskimos in what is all of a sudden a game with playoff implications. Who would have thought? The BC Lions, by virtue of a baby lotion soft section of their schedule, have won 4 straight games. All of a sudden, they've pulled their record to 5-10, and they've pulled themselves back into the conversation here in terms of the East Division crossover spot for the playoffs. BC coming off that 55-8 destruction of the Toronto Argos last week. 5 passing touchdowns from Mike Riley, 3 of those going to Brian Burnham. Just absolute domination from the opening whistle in that football game. Roll the highlight tapes, folks. John White in the running back position, 20 carries for $121 on the ground. Brian Burnham, like we mentioned, 8 catches for $145 and 3 scores. Touchdown passes to both Deron Carter as well as Shaq Johnson. Everybody was getting in on the act for the BC Lions offensively. And like I said, it's due in a large part to the schedule. Like, BC has feasted on terrible teams lately. They've played Ottawa, they've played Toronto, or they played Ottawa twice, and played Toronto. So they feasted on the bad teams, which is good. That's what you need to do. But now the games have suddenly become important, and BC doesn't exactly have a lot of live rounds playing against quality opponents in important football games. It'll be interesting to see how they react to it this week. The Edmonton Eskimos enter this game at 7-8 on the season. Losers last week, a 30-point loss against Hamilton. That was in Hamilton. They've only won 1 of their last 4 games, on a bit of a slide themselves, giving up 30 points a game over that span. Edmonton faced a 19-3 halftime deficit in this football game, and rather than rising to that challenge and saying, hey, we need to take some risks here, we got to get back into this game, they generate just a single touchdown in what was their worst loss of the season. A hat trick of interceptions for Logan Kilgore at the quarterback position, who only threw for 233 yards through the air. Also, very few running lanes for CJ Gable, who it looks like is not going to play in this game. He did not participate in practice, and it was no indication that he was only held out for precautionary reasons. So I would be very surprised if Gable played in this game after only posting 47 yards rushing on 11 carries in the game last week. Ricky Collins, he chipped in, led the way for the receiving corps, 4 catches, 53 yards. On the defensive side, I mean, the pass rush made some plays. They did manage to generate 3 sacks on Dane Evans and Hamilton, but the defense got carved up on first down. They allowed 11.3 yards per play on first down to the Hamilton Ticats. Now look, that's the Hamilton Ticats. I mean, that's a very good football team, but if you're giving up You're giving up a first down on every first down play. Like, how in the world do you expect to win? Also, doesn't help that the Eskimos took double-digit penalties for 108 penalty yards. You know, when your offense really isn't clicking, your defense isn't really clicking, the least you can do is not shoot yourself in the foot. Needless to say, my investor confidence in the Edmonton Eskimos right now is at basically an all-time low. And when you're talking about the playoffs, this big mystical idea of the playoffs, they've all of a sudden become like a very real possibility for the BC Lions when they were not for the vast majority of the season, and almost like a fading dream for the Edmonton Eskimos, who looked like they would be a sure bet to make the playoffs in the West Division. And now all of a sudden, oh boy. Even though they've been beating up on cupcakes lately, I have much more faith in the BC Lions right now than I do the Edmonton Eskimos. At least BC kind of knows what it feels like to win some football games lately. So I'm actually going to go with that. I'm going to take the Lions in what was originally an upset, is no longer, but I'm going to take the Lions here. I like the Lions to win this game in Edmonton. Let's take BC to beat the Eskimos. On the line, originally Edmonton was a 1-point favorite when the line opened. That has since moved to now the Eskimos are giving up 2.5 points as an underdog. But I'm going to lay those points on BC. I like them to win. It's a small price to pay. Let's take the Lions minus 2.5 points. Total in the game set at 45.5. I've got this sniffing 50 points. It might get there or it might fall just short. But either way, I feel good enough to say let's go over the 45.5 point total in BC and Edmonton. There you go, folks. Those are your picks for Week 18 in CFL action. We're going to go over them here with you one more time. I've got the Toronto Argos at home picking up the win over the Ottawa REDBLACKS, and we're going to lay a single point on the Toronto Argos as favorites, taking the Argos -1 in a game that goes over 48 points. I've got the Calgary Stampeders at home picking up the win over the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and we are going to lay 3 points on the Calgary Stampeders as favorites in a game that stays under 47.5. I like the Montreal Alouettes on the road to go into Winnipeg, pick up a victory over the Blue Bombers. I like Montreal +4 against the spread in a game that goes over 47 points. And in the week finale, I've got the BC Lions traveling to Edmonton, picking up the win over the Eskimos. We are going to lay the -2.5 on the BC Lions as road favorites in a game that goes over 45.5 points. That's it for me, Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at Nerd Tees. That's going to keep me awake while I edit this thing. Get used to our surroundings here because I've got another day shift next Wednesday at work. So chances are next week we'll probably be down here yet again. So hopefully this location brings me a little more luck than it did last time around. Enjoy the games in Week 18. We'll see you again next week.